Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to Sky News, to the centre of Manchester, and our continuing coverage of the terror attack that claimed 22 lives. Jeremy Corbyn has been speaking today about foreign policy here in the United Kingdom and how that might reflect on what happened on Monday. He declared the war on terror wasn't working. Returning to the campaign trail today, he directly addressed issues around the Manchester bombing.
We must be brave enough to admit that the war on terror is not working. We need a smarter way to reduce the threat from countries that nurture terrorists and generate terrorism. That's why I set out Labour's approach to foreign policy earlier this month. It is focused on strengthening our national security in an increasingly dangerous world. We must support our armed forces, Foreign Office, international development professionals and diplomats, engaging with the world in a way that reduces conflict and builds peace and security. Seeing the army on our own streets today is a stark reminder that the current approach isn't really working so well. So I would like to take a moment to speak to our soldiers on the streets of Britain. You're doing your duty, as you have done so many times before. I want to assure you that under my leadership you will only be deployed abroad when there is a clear need and only when there is a plan that you have the resources to do your job and secure an outcome that delivers lasting peace.
That went down very well with his supporters in the room. Not so much other members of society, not least the Defence Secretary, was very quick to come onto Sky News and tell us his views on what he'd heard from Mr Corbyn. Here's Michael Farmer.
We've increased the spending on the number of armed officers in our streets. We've protected the budget of the security services, and we are prepared to do what it takes to keep this country safe. It's Mr Corbyn who's opposed every serious piece of anti-terror legislation. He's the one who thinks you should somehow talk to terrorists, and he's even said he's not prepared to authorise RAF strikes against terrorists in the Middle East who may be preparing further attacks in Britain. That's very dangerous.
Speaking on behalf of the government, or perhaps more appropriately the Conservative Party, given that we are in the middle of an election campaign, what about the Liberal Democrats? Their leader, Tim Farron, he's been up here in the northwest today. He had this to say in response to what Mr Corbyn's speech was about earlier on.
We must never give terrorists an excuse. The reality is that 9/11 happened before the war on terror began. And what we must remember is that these evil people will find any recruiting sergeant, any excuse to exercise their evil activities. This is a moment where it may be tempting for politicians to point the finger at one another about the events that happened on Monday. But this is a time for our country to stand together and to come together.
Okay, let's get the views of Owen Jones, Guardian columnist and author, and Dan Hodges, commentator for The Mail on Sunday. Hello to you, gentlemen. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Owen Jones, to you first of all. We know that this is what he thinks. He's said it before. Is it appropriate for him to say things like this 3-4 days after 22 people were killed at the Manchester Arena?
I think this was a patriotic speech. I think it was a speech full of common sense. It was about defending this country from the threat of those who will maim and kill. Look, let's just be absolutely clear here, and this is what the speech also says, that the only person responsible for this attack is that, excuse my language, bastard who went into that arena and detonated himself amongst smiling children, and whichever accomplices helped him. And that's what the speech says very, very clearly, that it was entirely his responsibility and no causes we can talk about justify, rationalise, excuse this despicable, sickening atrocity. So let's get that clear. What we're talking about in this speech, and it is perverse after 16 years now since the so-called war on terror was launched that we haven't had this discussion, is that we have to look at all the different factors behind the rise of extremism. One is, yes, a hateful ideology which perverts the most fundamental tenets of Islam to glorify the murder of innocents. One is disturbed men, often with a history of petty theft, drugs and alcohol, who are susceptible to this form of radicalisation. And the other is a foreign policy which we're told in Iraq would make us safer, But none of your viewers, I don't think a single one of your viewers would look at the Iraq war and everything that's happened since and said that that's made the world and this country a safer place, both because of the radicalisation that followed and also because in Iraq and Libya they became vast swathes of territory effectively seceded to murdering, rampaging terrorists. Now, if we can't have a grown-up conversation about this, then it worries me, because the starting point of this kind of speech is how do we make our country safer? And if we can't talk after 16 years, when there are far more extremists and terrorists and far more atrocities than when the war on terror began in 2001, then I worry for the future of this country. It was, and I have to say, if anyone can read that speech and say there's anything objectionable about it, when it was heartfelt and blames the terrorists themselves for their actions, then I want to hear what those objections are, and I'm sure we'll hear them now.
Well, I see what Dan Hodges has to say. Dan?
Well, I agree with Owen. We have to have a grown-up debate about this and discussion about this. But the problem is, I think you've seen the flaw there in Owen's argument, and indeed in Jeremy Corbyn's argument. So Jeremy Corbyn says, and Owen very eloquently said, no one is to blame except the man who conducted this appalling atrocity, and then goes on to blame government foreign policy, then goes on to blame cuts in the police services, and then goes on to blame how British troops have been deployed abroad. And if we're going to have this grown-up discussion, we have to accept two things. Firstly, if you say and you draw a link between British foreign policy and the appalling events that we saw in Manchester, then you are, by definition, giving succor to the terrorists, because that is exactly what the terrorists do. And the second thing is, and this is the inexplicable, unavoidable logic of what Jeremy Corbyn is saying, Jeremy Corbyn has said explicitly, we need to change British foreign policy as a result of the atrocities, the like of which we saw in Manchester. And there is no avoiding the fact that that also gives succor to the terrorists. It's what the terrorists want to hear, and it's what they want us to do.
Right, let's just to respond to that. Firstly, numerous security officials, including two former heads of MI5, who I would say know what they're talking about on this particular issue, have said that the Iraq war increased the risk of terrorism and increased terrorism in actuality and led to further radicalisation. I don't think the former heads of MI5 are giving succor to terrorism by making that argument. And the second point, and often this always comes back, I don't want to sound all Ken Livingstone, back to the Nazis, but if you look at the rise of the Nazis, a historian, all of us would, this was a basic GCSE question, how did the Nazis come to power? We would look at the peace treaty of Versailles after World War I, we would look at the Great Depression and the economic consequences, and all of us would accept that they played a role in the rise of Nazism. Is that justifying Nazism? Is that letting the Nazis off the hook? Is that saying they're not responsible for what they then did? Of course it's not. It's saying that they exploited those conditions. Now, in terms of foreign policy radicalisation, these extremists, and they are fanatics, they are a death cult, exploit various situations, including the calamity in Iraq and Iraq. Now, the vast majority of people, the hundreds of millions of people who object to those wars, they don't strap themselves with bombs and detonate themselves in front of laughing kids. No one's making that argument. What we're saying are there are lots of different factors at play, and one of them is the consequence of the breakdown of societies in Iraq and Libya, and it is about the resentment that was caused, and it is about, for example, a Saudi dictatorship, which is our ally, which exports violent, murderous extremism. If we can't have a debate about this, then I fear what we'll see, and if you look at a graph since 2001, you will see the number of people died has rapidly increased at an exponential rate. Is it working? Ask yourselves, all of you, in your living room now, in your workplace, wherever you are. Has the last 16 years of the war on terror made you safer? Of course it hasn't. How can we not have a debate?
Let Dan come in there. Let Dan come in there, if you would, please. I mean, a lot of people have made that point, but the question has to be also whether now is the right time to make that point, Dan, given that people died, 22 people died on Monday, and that some would suggest is electioneering.
No, just that criticism of Jeremy Corbyn I don't agree with. I think it's absolutely right. We are back into the election campaign. As Owen said, these are important issues. They need to be discussed openly. But you see, again, here we have the problem. Owen immediately goes back to Iraq, which everybody is aware of was a disaster. Nobody disagrees with that I'm aware of. But what Jeremy Corbyn is not talking about, Jeremy Corbyn is not talking about us withdrawing troops from Iraq, because they've gone. Okay? What we're talking about is current British foreign policy. Now let's use the example of Iraq. At the moment, in Iraq, British forces are targeting ISIS. They are specifically targeting the sort of people who walked into the Manchester Arena and killed those children. Now I'm going to ask Owen this specific question. Owen, do you think if we have these people in our sights in Iraq, we should take them out or we should not?
Yes, at the request of that government, yes. But
But that's not what Jeremy Corbyn is arguing, is he? Jeremy Corbyn has specifically refused to back that military action.
Well, no, that's a debate. Look, Dan, this is the absolute critical point.
It's not a debate. Jeremy Corbyn has refused to take that military action. He said so explicitly.
Dan, the problem we've got in both Iraq and elsewhere is we had that war in 2003, and those who opposed that conflict, who opposed that war, were vilified as apologists for Saddam Hussein. We have had no shortage of bombs.
But we're not in Iraq now, Owen. We're not in Iraq. There's no point just having a history lesson. All right.
No, well,
the only way, in fact, as I say, the only place
this is a critical point. No,
is to target ISIS. Now you admit we should be targeting ISIS, which is fine. But sadly, Owen, you're not standing for Prime Minister. Jeremy Corbyn is standing for Prime Minister, and he said we shouldn't target ISIS.
Dan, can we talk about actually what's going on in Iraq at the moment? Because actually, under Donald Trump, we've seen a dramatic escalation in airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, which have caused, in one case, the deaths.
You just said you supported that.
Listen, not the current strategy. Not the current strategy. This is an absolute fundamental point. The current strategy is killing hundreds of innocent civilians in Iraq. That is not the sort of military operation we should be having.
So we should just sit back and let ISIS do that?
No. We can talk about what sort of military operation we should have.
Right,
one
so
which at the moment
should have a military operation there.
Dan, listen.
That's what Jeremy Corbyn is saying. We should saying precisely the opposite.
Dozens of people at the moment, children, little kids, and families, are being murdered in Iraq by US bombs. Now the problem there is not just that's bad in its own terms.
Yeah, but they're being murdered. Dan,
can I just finish this
well? Should we try and get the people who are doing that if we can?
Well, I'm afraid to say this person wasn't from Iraq. He was born in Britain. Terrorists, as a general principle, in this country and in other countries, were not born in Iraq. Were not born in Syria. They were born here. And that is, I'm afraid, a frightening truth that we have to talk about. No, Dan, let me go back to Iraq. It's really important. The bombing of those kids at the moment is not just bad on its own terms. It's fueling extremism and it's fueling terrorism in those countries.
So, Owen,
if we have a military operation...
Owen, I'm sorry, I'm confused. Do you think we should be bombing in Iraq?
Not the current operation.
We should not be bombing in Iraq?
Not the current operation. It's failing the current operation because it's killing so many innocent civilians.
Owen, you said 10 seconds ago we should be bombing in Iraq.
No, I said the principle. I'm saying, yes, we should have some sort of military operation.
So you think we should in principle but not in practice?
Not the current... Dan, why is this hard? Donald Trump is the president of the United States. He's a megalomaniac. He's a threat to global peace. And the form of military action
I'm not talking about what Donald Trump does, Owen. I'm talking about what we do.
Dan, we're talking about the actual operation going on in Iraq at the moment. The bombing of Iraq at the moment is Donald Trump. He's the man in charge. He's the commander-in-chief. And the military operation in Iraq at the moment is killing dozens of people. We should mourn those children as well.
You just said, Owen, if we have ISIS in our sight in Iraq, we should take them out. I asked you said yes.
I'm saying the principle is right. We should have that kind of military operation, but not someone like Donald Trump. Not someone like Donald Trump.
We're not talking about Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not standing for election. Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn are standing for election.
Is Donald Trump president of the United States? Is he the commander-in-chief? Is he in charge of military operations in Iraq? Yes.
No, he's not in charge of Britain's military operations in Iraq. Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn will be in charge of Britain's military operations after the election, and that's the point.
He's leading the coalition in Iraq at the moment. He's the one dropping those bombs, and it's killing innocent civilians and fueling terrorism.
Gentlemen, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Very spirited debate, as always, when you two are with us. You're going to have to take that outside because we are sadly out of time. Thanks for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. We're back in just a moment.